Hi, and welcome to my presentation. First, however, let me introduce myself. My name is Hanjo Berressem. I teach American literature and culture at the University of Cologne, and I'm especially happy and grateful to be part of this series of talks as I, as well as my partner Nadine Berressem, have been fellows at Morphomata in the past, and we dearly love the place and the people who run it. So before I begin, our manifold thanks to our gracious hosts then and now, and of course also thanks to all of you for being here, wherever that might be. Another thing before I start is that I would like to ask you to do something. The inspiration for this comes from a friend and colleague, James Williams, who I once saw making use of a similar oratory device. Here goes. Please imagine on the floor in front of you a group of poisoned rats in their death throes, a mother and her young. The mother's teeth are bared, her eyes are wide open. Please keep that image with you for the next 40 minutes. In 1903, Ernst Haeckel relates ethology, in French ethologie, a word that had been coined by the French zoologist Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire in 1843 to designate the study of the relations between an organism and its environment, to ecology, in German Ökologie, a word Haeckel himself had coined in his 1866 book, General Morphology of Organisms. Haeckel's superposition of ethology and ecology occurs first in the 1903 edition of his book Anthropologie, or The History of the Evolution of Man, in which he writes that bionomy, and then he adds in brackets his explanation of the term, and you have this on the handout, ecology or ethology of the organisms concerns the manifold relations of animals and plants to each other and to the outside world. In light of Haeckel's conceptual superposition of the two terms, my question is the following. Might changes in the field of ethology be measured by, or maybe against, changes in the field of ecology? More to the specific argument of my paper, can what Félix Guattari, channeling deep ecologist Arne has called his ecosophy, be used to conceptualize what might be called an ethosophy? And further, if Guattari's ecosophy can be thought of as a schizoanalytic ecology, which is a term that I will explain in more detail later on, might one then conceive of something like a schizoanalytic ethology? In reference to the title of our conference, Ethology, Claims and Limits of a Lost Discipline, can the lost discipline of ethology be recovered perhaps in the light or even in the guise of Guattari's schizoanalytic ecology? A caveat, of course, is that any such terminological takeover should not disregard the ethology of ethology, by which I mean its specific character and history as a science, its development and its relation to other sciences, from Konrad Lorenz's and Nicholas Tinbergen's stress on biology and animal studies, to its subsequent dissemination into the fields of human ethology and psychology. Although the science of ethology is a frequent reference, a field of resonance, and a source of inspiration for Guattari and Deleuze, in their conceptual pickups, they also tend to rework from within ethological registers some of its underlying conceptualizations and assumptions. Take, for instance, the somewhat counterintuitive statement in 1,000 Plateaus from 1980 that, and you also have this on your handout, what holds an assemblage together is not the play of framing forms or linear causalities, but actually or potentially its most deterritorialized component, a cutting edge of deterritorialization. In other words, an organism's character is not so much defined by the borders that separate it from its environment, by which I mean its Umgebung, as opposed to its Umwelt or Milieu, nor is it defined by predictable general patterns of behavior, its speciality, one might say, but rather by its inherent valences, in German Valenz or Wertigkeit, which means by the power or agency it has to bind elements from within the milieu to itself and vice versa. In other words, its connectivity, or in German Anschlussfähigkeit, its ability to create and participate in larger, more complex arrangements. As such, valences also mark its structural elasticities, the margins of its freedom of choice, which allows it to move and to act within a milieu, and this concerns not so much its speciality, but its specificity and affectivity. What holds it together is not its general character, its ethos, as a member of a species, but its specific potentialities that allow it at each moment to change its character, its habits, its habitats, and its interactions with the heterogeneous components of the milieu. The number of positive affects and structural alliances it can actualize within a milieu that is considered as a machinic, multiplicitous, and heterogeneous field of what today we tend to call affordances and constraints. And please do not read machinic here as something industrial, but simply as pointing to the fact that every milieu is a dynamic, infinitely complex network of organic assemblages, of what Leibniz called living machines. In this light, the ethological question of the taxonomy and the typology of species shifts from one of distinct essences and characters to one of relative complexities, to the inherent polyvalence and the margins of deterritorialization that define particular assemblages. How polyvalent is an assemblage? How free is it to enter into new alignments within an, at the same time, physical, chemical, biological, psychological, social, economic, political, and cultural milieu? How free is it to cross over between and operate within all of these milieus? Which is what Guattari and Deleuze mean by transversal movement or transversality, a diagonal movement, therefore. Can a rat, say, cross over into the cultural, for instance? In general, how great is an assemblage's potential to actively change and to navigate a milieu, that is, in order to remain alive? First move, therefore, from a typology and taxonomy of species and characters, Guattari and Deleuze shift to a typology of affects and of abilities to interact and to change, and this is ethosophy as affectology. And here we have already heard about the presence of Spinoza from Anthony and Moira. Jacob von Uexküll is such an important inspiration for Guattari and Deleuze because, quote, in defining animal worlds, he looks for the active and passive affects of which the animal is capable in the individuated assemblage of which it is a part. The sentence before they reference Uexküll's example of the tick is programmatic. In terms of its affectology of what it can do, quote, a racehorse is more different from a workhorse than a workhorse is from an ox. Specificity before speciality. The notion of nature as a network of heterogeneous assembled organisms implies, and of course natural scientists were the first to know, that nature is not so much natural in the way in which religion and philosophy conceived, for instance, of the light of nature as a lumen naturale and spirituale, but rather an everywhere dispersed heterogeneous light, And Fritz Heider calls this the multiplicity of light waves, or in German, wonderful word, Lichtwellenmultiplizität, which I mention because it introduces the notion of dispersion and of the scattering of light, in German, Zerstreuung or die Streuung des Lichts, that Martin brought into our discussion. This is why, again, somewhat counterintuitively, Guattari and Deleuze consider natural assemblages as, in actual fact, quote, unnatural. The plane of nature, they note, continually makes and unmakes assemblages, employing every artifice. At this point, let me say a bit more about the notion of schizoanalysis, because in its most abstract, the analysis of such a machinic nature concerns the analysis of continuities and discontinuities, in the sense that the analysis of a machine, of a computer, say, concerns the abstract architecture of connections and disconnections on its circuit board, or in German Platine, or more generally, its Schaltplan or Schaltkreis. A schizoanalysis is quite literally and simply such an analysis of flows and of cuts. One should not immediately relate it to schizophrenia, but to the Greek schizein, which means to cut or to part. A schizoanalytic ecology, then, is an analysis of a machine's architecture of flows and cuts, in terms of network theory, its relations and its nodes, performed from within ecological parameters. Now, and this is my second point, Guattari and Deleuze maintain that the relation between machinic milieus and machinic organisms is not one of unidirectional representation, but of mutual expression. This is why Deleuze's book on Spinoza is called Expressionism in Philosophy, and why Guattari proposes in schizoanalytic cartographies that the dynamics of territorialization and deterritorialization, which means of assembly and disassembly, but more of that later, are related to what he calls the expressive function. Quote, "It is a question here of all the expressive matters open to the facets of mutation and creation, genetic, ethological, semiotic codes, semiologies, and the ensemble of situations in which a constructivist expression is grafted onto material, phonic, scriptural, organic chains by starting to play the double game of being for itself and of being for something else." Now, for the following, I would be glad if people were to help me out, because I'm not an expert, and the next argument is therefore somewhat hypothetical. If, in the shift from animal to human ethology, and thus from biosemiotics to human semiotics, people like Adolf Portmann and Walter Burkhardt introduce what Guattari might call a linguistic transversal into ethology, then this transversal is Saussurean and thus representational, at least let me assume this for the moment, while Guattari and Deleuze work with a Hjelmslevian semiotics that does not relate signifier and signified, and therefore implies the loss of the referent or of the real, but content and expression which retains that referent. While a representational semiotics tends therefore to separate animal from human ethology, in Guattari and Deleuze's expressive schizoanalytic semiotics, the notion of instinct is revealed as a black box that hides complex non-human semiotics that operate on imperceptible plateaus of micro-machinic operations. Even the most microscopic levels, that is, are defined by a machinics and a, quote, biologico-behavioral engineering of components. Guattari mentions, for instance, the case of stigmergy, which is the process by which ants pass information to one another by way of paths. It's a kind of semiotic pathology, one might say. The semiotic materials in stigmergy are not signifiers, but what Guattari and Deleuze call signalectic materials. In the case of humans, such signaletics cross over transversally between human and non-human languages. And this is why Guattari and Deleuze, again, I guess this is my assumption, are especially fascinated by ethology's biosemiotics, and less so, I would guess, by its reliance in the field of human ethology on a Saussurean semiotics. But I'm glad sort of to learn more, and it actually would be even better if ethology would not rely on a Saussurean semiotics, but I doubt it. Only an expressive, signalectic semiotics allows for non-human and human languages to intersect. So to recapitulate, in topological terms, the coherence of an organism, or as Guattari also calls it, of a consistency, in the meaning of anything that is consistent, is established by way of its capabilities to move transversely across heterogeneous plateaus and strata, and thus, quote, to cut and create connections. As I noted earlier, quote, what holds all the components together are transversals, and the transversal itself is only a component that has taken upon itself the specialized vector of deterritorialization. In ethological terms, to align one's individual machine with the all-over machine of a given milieu does not only rest on the creation of an existential territory in the sense of a living map of a milieu, but also on the ability to disassemble that territory, considered in the following as an act of complexification rather than destruction or deconstruction. Which brings me to my second part. Guattari and Deleuze import much of what they say about ethology in 1,000 Plateaus, especially in the chapter of the Refrain, 1853, from a chapter of Guattari's 1979 book, The Molecular Unconscious, that is called The Ethology of Sonorous, Visual, and Behavioral Refrains in the Animal World. Refrains for Deleuze and Guattari, or better, I should also again say Guattari and Deleuze, are components in the construction of a territory, which is of course a seminal term in ethology, and which I will define for this occasion as a consistency's existential map of a material space, the milieu, in which a heterogeneity of territories are superposed. The bird, the mouse, the cat, 3 territories, 1 milieu. From within this definition, the common notion that the map is not the territory should be written or rewritten as the territory is not the milieu. In the chapter, Guattari ecosifies ethological observations about the courtship rituals of birds. While some of these rituals are assembled from predominantly actual material components, according to a logic of representation, as when the male presents an actual blade of grass to a female, others are assembled from predominantly virtual, as in immaterial components, according to a logic of expression, as when a bird uses specific musical melodies and refrains that involve dynamic arrangements of, quote, variable abstract affects, existential rhythms, and territorial counterpoints. And psychoanalysis might identify this shift as one from metonymy to metaphor. From this ethological observation, Guattari deduces that already in animal behavior, there are within each territory vectors that point toward that territory's deterritorialization, which does not mean, as I said, so much its destruction or dismantling, but rather its complexification. And this, against many readings of Guattari and Deleuze, is their ecological move. Deterritorialization does not destroy an existential territory. It allows a consistency's expressive registers to develop, like the bird, from choosing between a limited number of predominantly actual material components and their valences to choosing between a multiplicity of more virtual, immaterial, and polyvalent components. In ethological terms, in every territory, there's a vector from fixed, hardwired instinctual programs to the possibility of more open, you might argue, more software-driven choices. And this is sort of more what in Germany we would call Weltoffenheit or Weltanschlussfähigkeit. And let me illustrate this. In her book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, the American nature writer Annie Dillard describes the entomologist Jean-Henri Favre's description of the devastating instinctual determination with which a species of caterpillars, symptomatically called pine processionaries, circle endlessly around the edge of a round vase, never realizing that this procession will go nowhere and thus is not open to what Henri Bergson would call creative evolution. At this point, let me also remind you of the image of the dying rats and ask you to add to that image of the rats, the image of such a hopeless caravan of caterpillars. As Dillard describes it, quote, a closed circuit of caterpillars, leaderless, trudging around this vase on a never-ending track. Favre wants to see how long it will take them to catch on. To his horror, they march not just an hour or so, but all day. When he leaves the greenhouse at night, they are still tracing that wearying circle, although night is the time they usually feed. After 2 days, Favre concludes that the caterpillars, quote, starved, shelterless, chilled with cold at night, cling obstinately to the silk ribbon covered hundreds of times because they lack the rudimentary glimmers of reason which would advise them to abandon it. This is the infernal version of Uexküll's work, World of the Tick, the dark side of ethology's fixed action patterns. In this context, Guattari considers the development of operational refrains into both, quote, animal and human assemblages as the introduction of mediators that systematically thwart, quote, the rigid oppositions between the acquired and the innate, between a rigorous biological determinism and the freedom of invention. Refrains and rituals function as complex transversal operators that cross over, quote, parallel universes which seemed to never have to communicate together, such as the hormonal, perceptive, ecological, social. In fact, Guattari stresses that, quote, evolution can be called creative only by taking into consideration the general tendency towards the efflorescence, that is the flowering out of, or singularity salts from stone, of the most deterritorialized forms. And you see examples of such salt flowers on my keynote presentation. Once more, Guattari uses an ethological vocabulary when he describes this flowering out as, quote, a deterritorialization of his Umwelt, which has led man to invent diagrammatic operators such as faciality and refrains, enabling him to produce new machinic territorialities. As, quote, this kind of evolutionary machinic escape can already be located in the animal world, the difference between animal and human is not a categorical one of species, but a relative one of the overall number of choices, of the varieties of modes of expression, and of the overall coefficient of deterritorialization. In his book Schizoanalytic Cartographies, Guattari defines these dynamics from within a directly ecosophical context, which superposes the fields of, quote, social ecology, mental ecology, and environmental ecology, or, in other words, the fields of the human, the mental, and the non-human ecology. In the molecular unconscious, Guattari cautions that, quote, it is advisable to banish at the same time any idea of dialectical progress, as well as any unfavorable moral connotation in the appreciation of these successive movements of deterritorialization and re-territorialization. What counts is neither the utopia of total freedom nor the dystopia of complete determinism, but rather the complex operational spaces that develop between these two extremes. In schizoanalytic cartographies, Guattari maps out these spaces in a diagram, or again, Schaltkreis, which I show you mainly because I find it really fascinating and I wanted you to have seen it at least once. And here's a very telegrammatic shorthand of sort of how to position terms in the diagram. The diagram aligns on its left side the quantitative world in the sense of the world conceived as without qualities. This purely actual material world for itself is initially one of continuous flows, but it already contains within it the singularity salts, or the programs that allow for the creation of a discontinuous, although still indifferent, machinic network. And in relation to Anthony's talk, I was thinking that maybe you could say that it replaces Virginia Woolf's title, The Waves, with the planned title, as Anthony told us, The Moths. The right side denotes the qualitative world in the sense of the world conceived as without quantities. This virtual, immaterial world for something else is initially one of continuous territories and sensations, but it already contains within it the singularity salts or programs that allow for the creation of discontinuous and differential mental universes and sense. Sort of wave-like affect folds into aerosolic thought. These two sides are related according to a mutual expression, and as such, the diagram recapitulates Spinoza's parallelism of body and mind as the complementarity that in actual fact it is. Those are the two aspects of the same world. As Spinoza notes, mind and body are one and the same thing, conceived now under the attribute of thought, which would be the right side, now under the attribute of extension, which is the left side. The left side is the abstract actual world, the right side the concrete virtual one. Guattari's ecosophical move consists of the folding of the two sides of the diagram onto each other, in the sense that every virtual sensation and thought is embodied, and every body is, as Ralph Waldo Emerson noted, ensouled, and to consider ethology from within the spectrum that reaches from existential affective territories, and remember Uexküll's tick and the prime processionaries, to synaptic mental universes considered as the field of the deterritorialization of existential territories. Guattari once again uses ethological terms to describe the diagram, quote, neither absolute deterritorialization of pure self-awareness, nor the automatism of an ant colony. Freedom consists in the give and take of quanta of deterritorialization emitted by refrains, facialities, and so on, and carried by the ensemble of the components of an assemblage, whether these quanta be material or libidinal, individual or group-oriented, private or public. By thus negotiating their free valences, their degrees of freedom, optional subjects, refrains, and faciality constitute themselves in the privileged place of micropolitical confrontations. In Guattari's squaring, refrains are territorial, existential, and affective, such as the habitual movements and existential routines, as opposed to free, dispersed, as in deterritorialized fields of thought. These allow a conceptualization of virtual universes that is defined by an infinite number of potential choices, the freedom of thought. In this context, Guattari points to the deterritorializing function of the synapses. Although any new connection is predicated on an earlier disconnection, however, one should always remember the folding or superposition of the two sides of the diagram. The human being is always caught in the impossible middle or milieu. And this is then ethology as schizoanalytic ecology, I would argue, to position ethological questions within this kind of fourfold diagram. At this point, the ecosophical logic loops back onto the ethological notion of character. Once the field of ethology is considered as fully machinic, creative evolution concerns not so much strict borders between plant, animal, and human, but rather, as I noted before, the transversals between them. And this brings into play Deleuze and Guattari's notions of becoming plant, becoming animal, and becoming human, which do not only put pressure on ethological typologies, taxonomies, and characters, but also invade ethology's very conceptuality, its figures of thought. And this is my third and final and probably most important point. Remember, the first point concerned the shift from a representational to an expressive logic. The second concerned the deterritorialization of territories and Guattari's squaring of ethology into ethosophy. The third point is that if ecosophy concerns social, mental, and environmental realms equally, it should also define its own mode of thought and of feeling. It must put its money where its mouth is, one might say, which means here that it must put its practice where its theory is. It must disperse itself. In the molecular unconscious, Guattari evokes the somewhat scandalous concept of a dispersed aerosolic thought. While ethology is one field that has inspired such a thought, in order to turn ethology into ethosophy, that thought, which is perhaps the ecological version of Martin's notion of dispersed thought or zerstreutes Denken, and which pervades the animal and the human world equally, would need to be folded back onto ethology. Quote, what kind of scandals would arise in affirming that a thought, if you will, governs the evolution of every branch of the animal phylum? Admittedly, not an individually arranged thought, but a thought with n dimensions, where everything starts to think at the same time, individuals as well as groups, the chemical as well as the chromosomal, or the biosphere. In conclusion, let me illustrate such an ecosophically dispersed thought. For this, I hope that you still have the image of the dying rats in your mind, and let me fill in the situation. The image, and those of you who do German studies have of course known all along, is taken from Hugo von Hofmannsthal's The Letter of Lord Chandos from 1903, which means that we are back in the very same year in which Haeckel for the first time superposed ethology and ecology. But while Haeckel is still fully concerned with the natural world, the letter, which introduces a variable menagerie of animals, and I've counted mosquitoes, deers, cows, spiders, horses, dogs, rats, beetles, earthworms, quails, cats, cricket, and moraines, and this all in a kind of like 10-page text, relates a truly ecosophic and expressive superposition of animal and human ethology, and as such, it is a magnificent manifesto of what might be called literary ethosophy. In his letter, Chandos describes this vision of a pack of rats that he had ordered to be poisoned on his farm in the morning. Trotting along a field in the afternoon, he suddenly sees the rats dying in that farm's cellar. In a Madeleine moment, he is inside the cellar, and the cellar is inside of him. In a superposition of this scene with the image of burning Carthage, in German Carthago, Chandos finds that in this scene, quote, there was more, something more divine, more bestial, and it was the present, the fullest, most exalted present. There was a mother surrounded by her young in their agony of death, but her gaze was cast neither toward the dying nor upon the merciless walls of stone, but into the void, or through the void into infinity, accompanying this gaze with a gnashing of teeth. A slave struck with helpless terror, standing near the petrifying Niobe, must have experienced what I experienced when, within me, the soul of this animal bared its teeth to its monstrous fate. One page after the workhorse, the ox, and the tick, Guattari and Deleuze describe Hofmannsthal's meeting of animal and human ethology on the dissecting table of the logic of expressionism from within the logic of an ecosophic, fully dispersed ethology. By way of the becoming thought in a rat, and as the other extreme, the becoming rat of a human thought. Quote, when Hofmannsthal contemplates the death throes of a rat, it is in him that the animal bares his teeth to a monstrous fate. This is not a feeling of pity, as he makes clear, still less an identification. It is a composition of speeds and affects involving entirely different individuals, a symbiosis. It makes the rat become a thought, a feverish thought in the man, at the same time as the man becomes a rat, gnashing its teeth in its death throes. The rat and the man are in no way the same thing, but being expresses them both in a single meaning, in a language that is no longer that of words, in a matter that is no longer that of forms, in an affectability that is no longer that of subjects. And this perhaps is how an expressive ethology would look and think. Becoming ethosophy. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you soon. Some of you tomorrow. Bye-bye.